Mr. Bessel was a partner in the company Bessel, Hart, and Brown, of St. Paul's Churchyard. Among those researchers concerned with the study of the mind, he was known as a very thorough investigator, but also as someone always prepared to listen to new ideas. He was unmarried and occupied rooms in the Albany, near Piccadilly. He was particularly interested in the transfer of thought and in apparitions of the living. In November 1896 he and Mr. Vincent, of Staple Inn, began experiments to see if it was possible to send an apparition of themselves through space, by the power of thought. At an arranged time, Mr. Bessel shut himself in one of his rooms in the Albany and Mr. Vincent in his living room in Staple Inn. Each then fixed his thoughts on the other, and Mr. Bessel attempted, by the power of thought, to transfer himself as a living ghost across the space of 2 miles to Mr. Vincent's apartment. On several evenings this was tried without any satisfactory result, but on the 5th or 6th attempt, Mr. Vincent did actually see or imagine he saw an apparition of Mr. Bessel standing in his room. He noticed that Mr. Bessel's face was white, his expression was anxious, and his hair was untidy. For a moment Mr. Vincent was too surprised to speak or move, and in that moment the figure seemed to glance over its shoulder and disappear. They had arranged to attempt to photograph any apparition, but Mr. Vincent was too slow to use the camera on the table beside him. However, excited by the first sign of success, he wrote down the exact time and at once took a taxi to the Albany to tell Mr. Bessel. He was surprised to find Br. Bessel's outside door open to the night, and lights on in the apartment. More surprising than this, a champagne bottle lay smashed on the floor, a table had been pushed over, and there were black finger marks on the walls. One of the curtains had been torn down and thrown onto the fire and the smell of burning filled the room. A shocked Mr. Vincent hurried to the porter's house at the entrance to the Albany. "Where is Mr. Bessel?" he asked. "Do you know that all the furniture is broken in his room?" The porter said nothing, but came to Mr. Bessel's apartment. When he saw the mess, he said, "I didn't know about this. Mr. Bessel's gone away. He's mad." He then explained that half an hour previously, at about the time of Mr. Bessel's apparition in Mr. Vincent's rooms, Mr. Bessel had rushed out of the gates of the Albany into Vigo Street and disappeared in the direction of Bond Street. "And as he went past me," the porter said, "he laughed, a sort of gasping laugh, with his mouth open and his eyes staring. He waved his hand, with the fingers bent like claws, and he said in a sort of fierce whisper, 'Life.' Just that one word, 'life.' Apostrophe." "Oh dear," said Mr. Vincent. He waited for some time but Mr. Bessel did not return. After leaving a note, he returned to his own rooms, unable to think of an explanation for Mr. Bessel's behavior. He tried to read but could not, so he went to bed early. When at last he fell into an uneasy sleep, it was at once disturbed by an upsetting dream. He saw Mr. Bessel waving his arms wildly, his face white and afraid. He even believed that he heard his friend calling to him for help. He woke up and lay trembling in the darkness. And when he finally went to sleep again, the dream returned and was even more frightening than before. He awoke with a strong feeling that Mr. Bessel was in some terrible danger and needed his help. Further sleep was impossible, so, although it was still dark, he got up and dressed, then went out towards Vigo Street to see if Mr. Bessel had returned. As he was going down Longacre, something made him turn towards Covent Garden Market, which was just starting to open. He heard shouting, then saw someone turn the corner and run towards him. He knew at once that it was Mr. Bessel, but a much changed Mr. Bessel. He had no hat, his clothes were untidy, and his shirt collar was torn open. He held a walking stick by the wrong end, and his mouth was pulled into a strange shape. "Bessel!" cried Vincent. The running man gave no sign of recognizing either Mr. Vincent or his own name. Instead, he hit his friend in the face with the stick. Mr. Vincent fell onto the pavement and, when he looked again, Mr. Bessel had disappeared. A policeman and several market porters were running after him towards Longacre. Mr. Vincent got up and was immediately the center of a crowd of people, anxious to help him and to tell him about the madman. He had suddenly appeared in the middle of the market screaming, "Life! Life!" hitting left and right with a blood-stained walking stick, and dancing and shouting with laughter. A boy and two women had broken heads, and he had smashed a man's wrist. Next, he had taken a lamp from a coffee shop and thrown it through the post office window before running away laughing. Mr. Vincent wanted to run after his friend and save him from the angry people chasing him. But then news came through the crowd that Mr. Bessel had got away. Mr. Vincent returned to his rooms angry and puzzled. It seemed that Mr. Bessel must have gone violently mad in the middle of the thought transfer experiment. But why did that make him appear with a sad white face in Mr. Vincent's dreams? He shut himself carefully in his room, lit his fire, washed his injured face, and tried without success to read until night became day. Only then did he go to bed and sleep. He got up late, his bruised face in considerable pain. There was nothing about Mr. Bessel in the morning newspapers and, after a visit to the Albany, where nothing had changed, he went to see Mr. Hart, Mr. Bessel's partner and friend. Mr. Vincent was surprised to learn that Mr. Hart, although he knew nothing of what had happened to his friend, had also been disturbed by dreams of Mr. Bessel, white-faced and apparently begging desperately for help. I was just going to go and see him at the Albany when you arrived, said Mr. Hart. I was sure that something was wrong with him. The two men decided to ask about their missing friend at the police station. Here they learned that the police had not caught Mr. Bessel, but that he had gone on to smash windows along Tottenham Court Road, had hit a policeman in Hampstead Road, and had then attacked a woman. All this happened between 12:30 and 1:45 in the morning. In fact, there was evidence of Mr. Bessel's violence through London from the moment he ran from his rooms at 9:30 in the evening. But after 1:45, when he had been seen running down towards Baker Street, he had suddenly disappeared. All that day and all that night, Mr. Vincent waited for news, but none came. In his dreams that night he again saw Mr. Bessel's desperate, tear-stained face, and he also saw other faces, shadowy but evil, that seemed to be chasing Mr. Bessel. It was on the next day, Sunday, that Mr. Vincent thought of Mrs. Bullock, the medium, who was becoming famous in London at that time. She was staying at the house of Dr. Wilson Paget. Mr. Vincent went to the house, but he had hardly mentioned the name of Bessel when Dr. Paget interrupted him. "He communicated with us last night," said Dr. Paget. "It was at the end of the séance. He left the room and returned with a large piece of paper, on which were 5 words, written by an unsteady hand." But Mr. Vincent recognized the writing. It was Mr. Bessel's. "How did you get this?" he asked. Dr. Paget explained. During the séance Mrs. Bullock passed into a state of trance, during which she received a message that she wrote on the piece of paper with her left hand. "George Bessel, Baker Street, help." Strangely, neither Dr. Paget or the other 2 people who were present had heard of the disappearance of Mr. Bessel. They had put the piece of paper with the many other mysterious messages that Mrs. Bullock had delivered. When Dr. Paget heard Mr. Vincent's story, he got to work at once to investigate this clue. And indeed, it proved to be a good clue, as the missing Mr. Bessel was found at the bottom of a large hole near Baker Street Station. The hole is part of the work to prepare for the new electric railway, and it is protected by a fence nearly 20 feet high. Somehow, Mr. Bessel must have climbed this fence before falling down the hole. His arm and leg were broken, but his madness had left him. He was, of course, very weak, and when he saw his rescuers arrive, he could not stop himself crying with relief. He was taken to a doctor's house in Baker Street and given something to help him sleep. But on the second day he gave a statement, which he has since repeated several times. To understand it clearly, it is necessary to go back to his experiments with Mr. Vincent. Mr. Bessel says that he did actually, by the power of thought alone, leave his body and pass into some place or state outside this world. At one moment I was sitting in my chair with my eyes tightly shut, he says, fiercely concentrating my mind on Vincent. Then I saw myself outside my body, saw my body near me, but not containing me. I felt I had become a kind of cloud, attached to but not part of my physical body. I could see the Albany and Piccadilly and Regent Street, and all the rooms in the houses, very small and very bright, spread out below me like a little city seen from the sky. What amazed me most is that I saw quite clearly the insides of the houses, saw people eating and drinking, talking, playing cards. I could see everything that went on. Those were Mr. Bessel's exact words. Forgetting Mr. Vincent, he remained for a time observing these things. Then, becoming curious, he reached down with a shadowy arm and attempted to touch a man walking along Vigo Street. But he could not do it, though his fingers seemed to pass through the man. Something prevented him, but he finds it difficult to describe what it was. He compares it to a sheet of glass, which stopped him getting through to the physical world again. But one thing impressed him immediately. He was in a world without sound. His first concern was what he might be. He was out of his physical body, but that was not all. He also believed that he was somewhere out of space altogether. By an enormous effort of thought, he had passed out of his body into a world beyond this world. A world not dreamed of, yet in some strange way lying so close that all things on this earth are clearly visible, both from outside and from within. It was then he remembered Mr. Vincent and turned his mind to traveling in this new body. For a time, he was attached to his physical body, and his new strange cloud body could not break free from it. Then quite suddenly he was free. For a moment everything was hidden by what seemed to be dark clouds. Then through a break in the clouds, he saw his body fall away, and he was moving along in a strange place of shadowy clouds with London spread out beneath them. But now he became aware that it was not clouds surrounding him, it was faces. Faces of thin shadow, with evil, greedy eyes and ugly smiling lips. Their cloud-like hands tried to catch him as he went past, and the rest of their bodies faded away into the darkness. No sounds came from their mouths. The shadowy Mr. Bessel, now filled with terror, passed through this silent moving crowd of eyes and reaching hands. So ghostly were these faces, so evil their staring eyes, that Mr. Bessel did not think of speaking to them. Their expressions were of envy and a hungry desire for life. And yet, even among these noiseless evil things, he could still think of Mr. Vincent. He made a violent effort of thought and suddenly found himself moving towards Staple Inn. He saw Vincent sitting in his chair by the fire, and for a time he tried to get in front of his friend's eyes, to move objects in his room, to touch him. But Mr. Vincent was not aware of him. That strange something that Mr. Bessel compared to a sheet of glass separated them. And at last Mr. Bessel did a desperate thing. He could see not only the outside of a man but also within, so he reached out his shadowy hand into, it seemed, his friend's brain. Mr. Vincent sat up suddenly, and in an instant Mr. Bessel knew that he had been seen. At the same moment Mr. Bessel knew that a great evil had happened to his body. He immediately forgot Mr. Vincent and flew back to the Albany, and the countless surrounding faces flew with him, like leaves before a storm. But he was too late. The body he had left, lying there like a dead man, had stood up, using some strength beyond his own. Now it stood with staring eyes, stretching its arms. For a moment Mr. Bessel watched, then he moved towards it. But the sheet of glass stopped him again, and the evil faces around him laughed. The little, round, middle-aged body that had once been his was now dancing with mad delight, throwing his furniture around, tearing his books, smashing bodies. He watched all this in terrified amazement. Then, with the evil faces crowding round him, he hurried back to Vincent to tell him of the dreadful thing that had happened to him. But the brain of Vincent was now closed against apparitions as he hurried out into Holborn to call a taxi. Defeated and full of terror, Mr. Bessel again flew back to find the body he had left. It was running and shouting happily down the Burlington Arcade. It had Mr. Bessel's body, but it was not Mr. Bessel. It was an evil spirit out of that strange world beyond our own. For 20 hours it held possession of Mr. Bessel's body, and during that time Mr. Bessel's cloud body, or spirit, was in that mysterious middle world of shadows, looking for help. He spent many hours trying to enter the minds of Mr. Vincent and of his friend Mr. Hart, but without success. And all of the time he was terrified that the body would be killed by its furious owner, and he would have to remain in this shadowland forever. Mr. Bessel was not the only human spirit in that place. He met several shadows of men like himself who had lost their bodies and who were wandering in that lost world that is neither life nor death. They could not speak because that world is silent, but he knew that they were men because of their shadowy human shapes, and the sadness of their faces. But how had they come into that world? And where were their lost bodies? Dr. Wilson Paget believes that they are the same spirits of those men who are lost in madness on earth. At last Mr. Bessel came to a place where a little crowd of spirits was gathered. Pushing through them, he saw below a brightly lit room. In this room were 4 or 5 men, and a woman sitting awkwardly in a chair with her head thrown back. It was Mrs. Bullock, the medium. and he could see a strange light, sometimes bright, sometimes faint, moving about inside her brain. She was talking, and at the same time writing with one hand. And Mr. Bessel saw that the human spirits around him were all trying desperately to touch these lighted parts of her brain. When one managed to do this, or another was pushed away, her voice and her writing changed, confusing the spirit messages and making them impossible to understand. But suddenly Mr. Bessel understood what was happening. The woman spoke for the spirit that touched her. Desperately he began to struggle towards her, but he was on the outside of the crowd and could not reach her. So, he went away to find out what was happening to his body. After a long time, he found it at the bottom of a hole in Baker Street with its leg and arm broken. At once Mr. Bessel returned to Mrs. Bullock in the séance. It was almost finished and many of the shadows were going away in despair. Mr. Bessel struggled through them and managed to reach the woman's brain. And in that moment, she wrote down the message that Dr. Pager kept. After that, the other shadows pushed Mr. Bessel away. He went back to Baker Street and waited, watching the evil spirit inside the body swearing and crying with pain. Then as the night changed to day, the brain shone brightly and the evil spirit came out. And Mr. Bessel entered the body he had feared he would never enter again. As he did this, the long silence ended, and he heard the traffic and the voices of people above him. And that strange world that is a shadow of our world, the dark and silent shadow of desire and the shadows of lost men, disappeared. It was 3 hours before he was found in that dark, damp place, crying and in pain. But his heart was full of joy. He was back once more in the kindly world of men.